The question of what was GamerGate even is typically phrased as, was GamerGate a movement to demand ethical reform in games journalism, or an anti-feminist hate mob using ethics in games journalism as a smokescreen? But even that is framing the question in GamerGate's terms. For the people who knew what GamerGate was but did not participate in it, what GamerGate referred to as anti-GamerGate but was really just the entire rest of the world, the question was GamerGate openly misogynist, or a bunch of frustrated gamers misdirecting their anger? And that was really a question of proportion. Put another way, to what extent did GamerGate know it was an anti-feminist hate mob? No one has numbers on GamerGate, in large part because gators often congregated on anonymous forums that disguised their numbers or created multiple fake Twitter accounts. But it seemed to shake out into two groups, one small and one large. The first group wasn't necessarily interested in journalistic integrity, but found it a useful cover when harassing women and minorities in the game space, and a useful way to network with others who did the same. This was the group that drove 3 women from their home, doxed many others, sent armed SWAT teams to the houses of their critics with false reports, and, well, we'll be here all day if I read the entire rap sheet. The second group, which by any estimation was much larger, is where we found our angry Jack. Jack sincerely believed there was something wrong with games journalism and was sincerely angry about it, but he spent most of his time with GamerGate, instead of meaningfully discussing ethics, talking about how he wasn't part of the first group, about how he couldn't do anything about the first group, and about how unfair it was to dismiss everything he had to say about journalism because of the first group's actions, because he wasn't responsible for them. But the first group was GamerGate. This was the group that jumped on a post from an ex-boyfriend detailing his breakup with game developer Zoe Quinn, a post that had been taken down from 2 different web forums and then rewritten, workshopped to appeal to precisely this audience. It was this group that invited the ex-boyfriend into a 4chan IRC with the express, in their own words, intent to destroy Zoe Quinn, among others. It was a 4chan raid against a feminist on the internet, just like the 4chan raids against Tumblr feminism, against Twitter feminism, and for the last 3 years, against Anita Sarkeesian. It didn't begin with gamers. It began on 4chan's Politically Incorrect, a subforum popular with anti-feminists and neo-Nazis, the forum that spearheaded Operation Lollipop, where they created fake Twitter accounts in an attempt to discredit black feminism, among other things. It was this group that selected ethics in games journalism as a shield against criticism, taken from a single short section of the original post and blown up in importance. This was a topic many of them were openly contemptuous of, but as the post had shown, a website can delete content easily if it's simply smearing a woman. That's just good moderation. But if you call yourself a reform movement, suddenly moderating harassment gets framed as censorship. And presenting that appearance of a reform movement depends on bringing in true believers, people who believe what you say, even when you don't. Ethics in games journalism was selected deliberately to appeal to gamers like Jack, people who remembered a couple provable ethics violations from several years earlier, people who were nervous about how games culture was changing and wanted a boogeyman to blame for it, people looking for an excuse not to listen to feminist critique of games. It was the first group that selected the name GamerGate from a TV celebrity tweet commenting on a video about Zoe Quinn's sex life. It was the first group that claimed GamerGate was a different movement from the already active harassment campaign, despite containing all of the same people. This group is where GamerGate came from. And all of this was standard operating procedure for Paul, and it was all public record from about a month after everything began. And in the rare instances where Jack actually didn't know about it, it was because he didn't want to know. The first group was not a fringe element of shitty people aligned with his movement. It was their movement. He aligned with them. So, what did these two groups want? What did they achieve? And what did they have to gain from allying with each other? Well, On the face of it, that last question is pretty basic. They deflected criticism for each other. Criticize a member of the first group for harassment, and he'd disappear into the crowd of the second, saying, "We're a legitimate movement. I'm not harassing anyone. I'm just here to talk about ethics." And the second group would believe and defend him. Criticize a member of the second group for his arguments, and he'd say, "You just won't take me seriously because you think I'm one of them." This was the completely symbiotic relationship between Jack and GamerGate. Without each other, GamerGate might have burned itself out within a couple months, while Jack would have found out if his rhetoric about journalistic corruption actually held up in an honest debate. But let's come back to this. What did GamerGate want? The short version is war. They wanted to destroy the other anywhere they found it, a desire that predates GamerGate by a long way. Look at all the military language. Look at all the anti-progressive allies. The core of GamerGate doesn't want to live in a feminist, anti-racist world, but also doesn't actually have the power to prevent one from existing. But they do have the power to impede it, to disrupt progress, to wrap bigotry in a bunch of political euphemisms to make it more culturally acceptable. This is a war in the Norse mythology sense, a war that can't be won, but can be prolonged. Within that framework, they could achieve a few things. One was simply to make Zoe Quinn, and Anita Sarkeesian, and Lee Alexander, and Brianna Wu, and Maddie Bryce miserable. Any day these women wake up wondering, is it worth it to continue, is a victory. Doesn't matter that their efforts have made many of these women more well-known and better respected. In fact, in a, I'm going to assume, mostly unconscious way, it works in their favor. If they actually managed to destroy all of their targets, they'd have to find new ones to take their places. Because that's how a persecution complex works. You have to keep your persecutors around. It's how you define yourself. It's how you pretend that they have the power and you're taking it back. The other achievement was to make sure basically nothing these women or their male allies ever say goes unchallenged, to discredit them. So when Ian Chung speaks critically of GamerGate, they dig up racist comments he's been disavowing for years and make sure to call him a Nazi every time he speaks, and then say the same thing to Arthur Chu and joke about how they can't tell these two Asian guys apart, except it's not a joke because they actually can't. And when they can't dig anything up, they invent it. Sarah Nyberg speaks out against GamerGate. Just say she fucks dogs. Tim Schafer mocked GamerGate at GDC. Just call him a racist. And the upsetting thing is that this works, at least some of the time. Studies show that reactionary comments can change how the public responds to a piece of media. It's why Popular Science turned off comments on their site. This intentional polarization from small minorities within a community is largely what movements like GamerGate are for. To react so negatively as to make a reasonable statement seem like the far end of a spectrum, and to make the halfway point between reasonable and bugfuck irrational seem like the moderate position. And that moderate position was the niche carved out for Jack. What Jack wanted out of his involvement with GamerGate was complicated. Jack's difficulty was that he couldn't admit publicly or to himself that he and the worst elements of GamerGate wanted the same things. Jack needs to believe he's the good guy. When Zoe Quinn makes something that goes against the grain of what games culture usually produces, and dedicates some of her time to bringing more women into that culture, and publicly favors reforming that culture to make it more hospitable to women, Jack starts to worry that his participation in the culture she's trying to reform might make him the bad guy. So he looks around for a reason to dismiss her, and no one has a longer list of reasons to dismiss Zoe Quinn than the people harassing her. In fact, they have a list of reasons why every time he feels this way, it's someone else's fault. If Jack wants to call himself the good guy, he can't participate in or condone the most blatant harassment. But he's not going to cry that it's happening. And if Quinn someday leaves the industry because of it, he's not going to cry about that either. And GamerGate was smart enough to feed him reassurances that his token anti-harassment lip service was literally the best he could do, and make him believe it. This was the dance of GamerGate. Getting someone to dedicate himself to your cause by constantly reassuring him he's nothing like you. So they handed him a spook story about journalistic corruption. A solid theory should be constructed like a table, an explanation supported by sturdy points of evidence, in this case testimony that game designer Zoe Quinn had slept with games journalist Nathan Grayson in exchange for a good review. From there, everything gets pulled into the narrative. Social justice warriors sneaking their politics into games, journalists doing favors for their friends, a culture of fear around speaking out against feminists. But then the facts come in. Grayson never wrote a review of Quinn's game. Nobody at Kotaku ever reviewed Quinn's game. Grayson never wrote anything about Quinn while they were dating, and the ex-boyfriend retracted the statement claiming it was a typo. But should one find themselves emotionally invested in that narrative, it's easy to come up with explanations for why the theory doesn't have evidence. Grayson and Quinn were dating in secret earlier than has been reported. A passing mention of Quinn in an article about another topic counts as positive coverage. Kotaku deleted the review and scrubbed it from their history. It doesn't matter if these arguments are contradictory, because they're interchangeable. Disprove one and it'll be swapped with another. This is how a conspiracy theory works, a theory supported by theories, where the value of a theory is not does it hold up to scrutiny, but does it lead to the pre-chosen conclusion. We can't trust these facts because we know journalists are liars. How do we know? Because of the evidence these facts would disprove. It's pointing and saying, you can't tell me it doesn't have legs. I know it has legs because it's a table, and tables have legs. Where most people would say, it's just a plank of wood. Jack's problem is how badly he wants that plank of wood to be a table. He sees high scores for games like Gone Home and would rather believe someone got to the reviewer than that thousands of people love Gone Home. He sees the queer romances in BioWare games and would rather believe they're products of the poisonous influence of social justice than acknowledge that hundreds of thousands of people like romancing the queer characters. He sees a punky, purple-haired woman making games about feelings and getting some of the same adulation as his idols, and he wants so badly to believe she slept her way into it. The culture of gaming is changing around him, and he just wants someone to tell him the problem is the culture, not him. What he wanted was to hang out in a room full of angry people telling him that being angry was the right way to be. What he wanted was for sites to publicly post an ethics policy, with no thoughts on what it should say, and fire the people he didn't like. Nothing that would solve an actual systemic problem, just the symbolic gesture that says, we heard you and you're right. The problem isn't you. What he wanted, even more than ethics, was lines between who he could and couldn't trust. Angry Joe, that's the star of The Angry Joe Show, not to be confused with Angry Jack, reported that while every topic about journalism GamerGate was ostensibly concerned with had threads on his forum, Gators would only go to expressly GamerGate threads, and every single one eventually violated his forum policies and had to be shut down. Because Jack doesn't actually want a conversation with anyone but other Gators. Black hat hackers, pedophiles, white supremacists, he may not personally like them, but they're Gators, so they have a right to be in his movement. Meanwhile, Lee Alexander has been talking about problems with games journalism since before GamerGate existed, but she's been critical of the movement, so she's dead to him. What he convinced himself he wanted was an honest conversation about games journalism, but he spent much of his time trying to pull videos off of YouTube, making research unusable, and storming out of PAX panels, making conversation impossible. What he achieved, what he was brought into GamerGate to achieve, was to amplify everything GamerGate did in his name. To pressure sites into covering the movement sympathetically or not at all, to respond to every report of harassment with skepticism and demands for proof, to muscle into every conversation about GamerGate and leave the door open for the serial harassers. If GamerGate's goal was to wrap bigotry in a political euphemism, Jack's job was to swallow and repeat the euphemism. That's what the alliance was for. Jack was always part of the plan. Now, I've been speaking in the past tense because GamerGate, the cultural event, is over. Jack may still believe he's the good guy, but it's become clear to him that no one else will believe it as long as he associates with the movement. Angry Jack has been jumping ship ever since Stephen Colbert invited Anita Sarkeesian onto his show and mocked GamerGate on national television. Even that rotten core of GamerGate has realized the name is poison and has started drifting into other reactionary movements. Unfortunately, GamerGate, the targeted harassment campaign, hasn't slowed down in the slightest. Every single name I've mentioned in this video, and many, many others, are still being targeted, and this video wouldn't exist if they didn't so consistently speak up, document what's happening to them, and argue their position. A lot of us are breathing a sigh of relief like GamerGate is almost over, because for us, it is. I've had to change my passwords and turn on two-factor authentication all over social media just to make this video, but I know anything that happens to me will be a fraction of what would happen to someone without my straight flush of privileges. One of the most horrifying things about Jack is that, in most instances, the reason he left GamerGate was because his peers started thinking he was an asshole, and not any of the lines GamerGate crossed. Jack may tell himself the jury is still out on feminism, but he is generally, at least in principle, against racism, and yet he was more than happy to sweep under the rug GamerGate's inextricable relationship with white supremacy. Unabashed neo-Nazis were core to the movement from the very beginning. One of the most publicly pilloried targets of GamerGate is Lee Alexander. Meanwhile, GamerGate harassment has led Maddie Bryce to quit games journalism and led Tariq Musa to leave Twitter. This is not to downplay the abysmal treatment of anyone targeted by GamerGate, white or otherwise, but to point out that the dominant narrative, even among articles condemning the movement, was that of angry gamers attacking a number of white women. This left out not only who many of the victims were, but that many of the attackers didn't really give a shit about games. They gave a shit about whiteness. Articles and blog posts acknowledging the racism in the movement didn't get elevated the same way, and consequently, people of color rarely got the same outpouring of support and allyship. And this narrative made it that much easier for Jack to insist that he does not condone racism, even as he refused to moderate racists out of his movement, refused to publicly condemn racist gators, and even joined in their abuse of people of color, insisting that he was in the clear because he did not personally use any racial slurs. That is how thoroughly Jack embraced "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." There was seemingly no philosophy horrible enough that he wouldn't align with it if it suited his purposes. Nowadays, Jack is by and large gone from the movement, but he's not gone. He's still out there, sulking in his room about how unfair it is that everyone thinks he's an asshole. And whenever the next reactionary 4chan raid disguising itself as something vaguely reasonable comes around, they're gonna go straight for Angry Jack. They probably still have his email, and provided they tell him the right things, he'll join back up in a heartbeat. A lot of websites decline to comment on GamerGate under the thinking that harassers are gonna harass no matter what you say about them. But I hope by now it's clear just how important perception is, how much effort was put into cultivating perception, and how much ground was lost when people stopped buying into it. Perception may not matter to the harasser, but perception is the difference between a crusade of a few hundred and one of a few thousand. In regards to Jack, perception is everything.